Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the organizers for having me. It's a distinguished honor to be here. My name is Anastas Vangeli. I'm a doctoral researcher at the Polish Academy of Science in Warsaw, also a fellow at the Zeitstiftung in Hamburg. I work mostly on China and Central Eastern European relations, but today we have a very broad and very challenging topic of bringing in three different external actors in the region. And external actors in Central Europe are a very intriguing topic. I mean, historically, at least it's been perceived and argued in the literature that the fate of the region has been as much determined by external forces as it has been determined by domestic actors and developments. Additionally, as we already heard in the previous sessions, we are at a very particular juncture of time, an era that is often called era of global uncertainty, where nothing is as we hoped it would be. Of course, developments across the Atlantic, developments in the continent, but also some developments in the Far East, which have caught many off guard. Luckily, today we have a very nice setup for distinguished speakers who I'm sure will help us develop very good insights in the topic. We have with us Petr Kratochvíl from the organizing institution, the Institute of International Relations. Thanks very much to you and your team for all the work done. It's a very fascinating event, a very nice venue, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Pass the thanks to the others.
Of course, we have Agatha Kratz from the European Council on Foreign Relations, who's working mainly on China and Central Eastern European countries. Then we have Roland Freudenstein from the Wilfried Martens Center on European Policy. And last but not the least, Ordzhonikidze. She taught me how to pronounce the last name. It was going to be a huge struggle. She's from the EU-Russia Center in London. So just to get the panel going into the topic, when we discuss, from some global perspective about the role of the US, the role of Russia, the role of China, there is the trap to kind of paint this very macro geopolitical picture which can kind of obscure actual processes and actual developments on the field. So I very much hope so that in our discussion, and I hope with my questions and with my opening, I can contribute for us to kind of transcend this perspective. In particular, in our discussion, what I would like to stress, and I hope we can discuss, is the multidimensionality and the multi-level nature of the relationship between Europe, and in particular Central Europe, and these external actors. There is, of course, the bilateral level between the member states and the external relations. There is the regional and the sub-regional level. You have the V4 setup in Central Europe. In the relations with China, there is the 16+1, and so on. And there is, of course, the larger international level, which could be the EU level, the NATO level, in the case of China, the level of Belt and Road, and so on. Then there is the notion of pluralism, and this is pluralism within Central Europe as a region. I mean, we take in account that there are some similarities and overlaps, but there's also many differences across countries, but also differences within countries. Different political elites, different political parties, different governments have pursued different external agendas, which then brings me to the point that we should, of course, in the discussion always tend to transcend the notion that Central Europe is some kind of playground. This is actually a region where there's actors who have certain agency and whose actions can also shape broader international political trends. And then there is the pluralism when we talk about the external actors themselves. In particular, for instance, the US. There is one idea of the US before Trump, and there is another idea of the US after the elections and with Trump in power. Then, of course, the notion of process, the notion of change, of evolution, of these relationships with the external actors. There is the short-term, the long-term perspective, which can be examined both from the practice and the thinking, you know. We heard many times in the opening statements, last year we thought something, this year we think something new, but what if we even go back in time, what we thought 5, 10 years ago, or even what is very particular about this region, 1989, and a very particular ideology that has shaped both the domestic and the international outlook of these countries. And of course, nuance is something that I think is very much in need in times of post-truth, post-factual politics and misinformation campaigns, because it's very easy to paint a black and white picture of the world. Or it's also easy to say it's a grayscale picture, but you know, and coming from myself from a kind of a China studies background, you know, but what if it's a kind of a yin-yang picture? What if there is some black, some white, and they kind of work together to comprise something that's a non-perfect but also non-catastrophic picture of the region and its relationship with external actors. Having this in mind, I would just outline some questions on the three actors, and then we would go with your statements. When it comes to the US, of course, there is the dichotomy of the US as an actor who has emanated certain values in the region of Central Europe, and also an actor that has to do a lot with security. And this also is manifested in various ways on the various level, and it comes also in the form very much of challenges, not only of advantages as of late. So, for instance, on EU level, it was mentioned already, the decision to leave the Paris Accords and the great divergence on climate change, which for Europeans is considered kind of a national security issue. There is on the NATO level, the debate on Article 5, whether the US would commit, would not commit, and so on. On a regional level, especially when we talk about values, there is the notion of normative counterflows. So very recently we had the pleasure or the displeasure to read about the proliferation of Trump-like figures in Central East Europe and the Trumpization of Central European politics. And I think being in the Czech Republic at this time can also, you know, to be a bit provocative, you know, on this topic. Speaking on the bilateral level, we have the news of Trump's visit to Poland to happen soon, which, you know, has some kind of security dimension, but also has a very questionable value dimension. And there's this awkward solidarity and sympathy on issue of closed borders, skepticism towards Europe, and some general liberal democratic consensus, which also is something to be behold of in the times to come. When it comes to Russia, it's very interesting for me to hear more on Russia in the context of the domestic politics of the various countries in Central Europe. You have one particular discourse in Hungary, which seems to be very much pro-Russia now. Then you have Poland, which, even though on the value level is very similar to Hungary and goes towards that kind of right-wing setup, is still very much distant and skeptical towards Russia. And then, of course, you have the Czech Republic, where there seems to be debate and different tendencies. Of course, with Russia, the perspective of process, evolution, and transformation of the relations between the region and Russia over time is very interesting. But very important for me is actually nuance, or lack thereof. And we discussed also in the break with Maria, there is always the trap, you know, to amplify certain aspects about Russia and to paint them in this black and white picture and sort of to miss the point, kind of miss the real analysis and the real effects of Russia in the region, which I think would be your task to address later on. And of course, China, which is, until not so long ago, very unfamiliar for people in the region. In the last few years, kind of coming back on a very loud note. On the EU level, you have the possible second honeymoon phase between EU and China, especially the reconvergence on climate. But then, of course, you have the skepticism. You have the perennial conflict between the national priorities, the policies of nation states on one side, and then the inability of Brussels to make them speak with one voice on the other. With Central Europe, you have 16+1, which is often perceived as a kind of a new East-West division. And then, of course, we have the debates on divide and conquer, which I think also, similar to the case of Russia, sometimes focusing too much on one aspect can really make us miss the bigger picture or some key details. And then we would be in need of debunking them. So without further ado, I would actually give the floor first to Maria, the points on Russia, and then I think we can continue and bring the different points into discussion. And of course, you can use the software for questions, very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much, Anastas, for introducing me, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. So I am here to speak about Russia as one of the players, one of the major players on what is called the playground of Central and Eastern Europe. And I think we will get back to the notion of playground, but I will concentrate today on what threats Russia presents today and whether they are real or perceived threats. Because I think a lot of our thinking, a lot of our understanding of what is going on in Russia now and how Russia affects the global order at the moment is obviously derived from the media, and media coverage tends to be black and white, as Anastas mentioned in his introduction. So what we really need to do is to look in detail on in what Russia is really whether it is really threatening on certain aspects or whether it's not really threatening, and what the real threats are, what the perceived threats are, and what the weaknesses are for us to explore how the threats can be tackled. So I would start with the most obvious threat, which is a military threat that comes from Russia in the form of conflicts, military conflicts currently obviously in Ukraine, in Syria, and I won't go into that because you are all aware what is going on. The other things that I also think can be described as military threats are terrorist threats coming from Russia, starting in the Soviet era, but most recently the grounded Malaysian Boeing, the Litvinenko assassination, and certain investigation that goes on into the Smolensk air crash, and other minor incidents that are currently and constantly going on. So that is something that is very widely covered in the media, and that is certainly has to be watched and considered. The other type of threats would be political threats, political intervention by Russia into neighboring countries or into countries in the Eastern Europe. Most recent episode of Montenegro, where again nothing is clear, but investigation is going on into certain involvement that was uncovered by Russian citizens and into alleged attempted coup against Milo Djukovic. Another thing would be again, something that has been widely covered in the media is the economic intervention by Russia, be it a state, be it state-owned corporations, or be it private corporations into the region. And that again has to do with the concept of energy weapon, which is selling gas to Europe, or European Union, and using that as a tool of trying to influence certain political decisions in the region. Again, Gazprom is a major actor in this respect, and its influence is not going down, it's in fact going up. So the exports of gas from Russia into EU now account up to 34%. And are growing. So by the end of, I think, 2035, Russia plans to increase that percentage up to 40. That is, again, something to watch and something to consider. But the main, sort of the old new phenomena that we are all witnessing at the moment is the very aggressive ideological intervention by Russian propaganda machine into the European region, and not just the European, just the US region as well. And I'm not sure how about China, but I'm assuming it's also the case there, but not as efficient. And here what Russia does is trying to undermine the values, the current the supported European values of tolerance, of openness, of democracy, and sometimes doing it via supporting of marginal political figures, marginal movements, or not very marginal populist movements. But so far that has been with certain success, but not with big success, I would say. So that is definitely something to watch very closely. Here, from this kind of 4 groups of threats, I would like to mention the sort of set the scene for the to explain how that can be rebuttal to how that can be perceived as not so so dangerous. So if we look at Russia at the moment, its economy is not very strong. We know that that Russian GDP is slightly more than 2% of the global GDP, and whereas European GDP is obviously much bigger. Euro area accounts for 11.6 trillion US dollars, and United States account for almost 18 trillion US dollars. So this is much more than Russia. So in terms of economic power, Russia is not in a position where it describes it is as it is. And so the other point on that is that in terms of weaknesses, what I see as a weakness for Russia is the growing domestic discontent. So inside Russia, the opposition movement, although not as strong as some people would consider it to be, it's still there. It is growing, and as of yesterday, we've seen quite a significant amount of demonstrations against the corrupted regime. And this is not going away, even though the state takes quite serious measures against the opposition leaders and against the people who take it out to the streets. But at the same time, it is introducing the laws that people are trying to fight against, like the property laws that now enable the state to take over people's houses and flats without any significant legal base, or just witnessing the corruption that is going on in all the echelons of power for a big number of Russian people. That is not acceptable. So this is staying, and this will stay. It looks like it's not going away. Now, the other weakness that Russia is currently facing is the high cost, economic cost and political cost, obviously, the high cost of existing military conflicts that it has to sustain on the borders of the EU, which is Ukraine and Syria again. And that Russia pays for that a lot of money, whereas its budget is not, it has a growing deficit.
So let's summarize.
Yeah, sorry, I'm
slowly.
just...
The main narrative, real versus perceived, if you can answer it in one sentence.
In one sentence. In one sentence.
What's real, what's perceived?
I think all the threats are real. What is perceived is the sort of the size of those threats, and that should be watched. And to the end of my speech, which I would not continue, I wanted to say that CE is uniquely positioned to be the actor who would be analyzing these threats and who would be advising the global community about the reality of them, or the actual meaning of them to the global order.
Thank you very much. We would then move a bit more eastwards to China. We have often in the public discourse kind of an assumption that China and Russia operate in a similar way, though they're a bit much more, actually there's significant difference in practice. Though the challenge remains the same, and as we have discussed many times in China Central Europe forums, there's always the need to debunk, especially this impression that China is dividing and conquering the region.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's always hard to address a topic or panel with 3 different countries that are so huge, but I'll try to do my best for those of you who aren't China specialists to make it easy. What I'm going to speak about here mostly is the new format of CEE, so Central and Eastern European countries and China relations, which has taken the form of something called the 16+1, which you will hear me say a lot, which is a format that was created in 2012 in Warsaw as a format for both economic and political cooperation. And when this was created in 2012, it raised a lot of eyebrows, it raised a lot of doubts and concerns in Brussels. First, because it was defining a sub-European region that was made of 11 member states, 5 non-EU member states, and it was pointing to a sub-relationship to what was usually an EU-China relationship handled at the EU level. So it raised a lot of concerns, and what I'm going to try to do today, just to start the conversation, not saying that division isn't happening, not saying that there isn't some ground for concern with the 16+1, but trying to debunk the idea that this solely divide and conquer scheme by China through 3 main ideas. The first one is very plainly just taking the stance of CE countries in this process. The 16+1 was established in 2012 on the initiative of China. So it's a China-led, very much China-managed relationship. However, there's a real interest of CE countries to take part in the initiative. Why? Because it gives them 3 kinds of recognitions that they're actually benefiting from. The first one is a recognition in China. So up until 2012, maybe 2010, there was very little spoken of the Central and Eastern European region in China. Why? Because it represented 12% of EU's GDP, 25% of the population, but much less than France, Germany, the UK could anyway be representing. And the EU-China relationship was pretty much a German-China, UK-China, Germany-China relationship, or at least it was dominated by those 3 powers. And so the creation by China in 2012 of this forum, 16+1, gave a voice to the CE country with China. Once a year, they meet with usually the highest ranking Chinese officials, and they get 20 minutes of their time, which they would never get in any other context. There's a political recognition at lower levels as well. There's a lot of mayors here, I've heard in the Czech Republic, but also everywhere in the CE region, being invited at the moment to China, being flown and fed and entertained in China because they're being recognized as such, and they now have a role to play for Chinese actors, central actors, provinces, cities. It's just, you name them. But there's also an economic recognition that is a very important one for the region, probably a very important point in why the CE countries just keep going with the 16+1 for 5 years now. Economic recognition through a number of projects that are being promoted. The Belgrade-Budapest line, for example, is one huge rail project that is being put forward. But a number of very large infrastructure projects in a region that does need infrastructure and does need a lot more investment. And also a recognition economically from business actors. You've got, of course, the big Chinese companies that all of a sudden discovered the CE region and discovered that their heads of state were flying once a year, if not more, to the region, and thought, well, if they do that, we should probably do it, because it's a good sign that we're going to get support for it. It's a good sign that there's something happening there. But also, and that's almost more interesting and important, of private actors, big companies like Huawei, big companies like BYD, who are now thinking of expanding their investment, expanding their factories in the region. So a recognition economically that the region had sense, that it had actually something else to offer than the Western part of Europe, that it had different things to offer, cheaper labor, but just as much skills, as much technologies, and a great market as well. So that's the second kind of recognition. And the third kind is actually very interesting, and is probably at the EU level. You had indeed the relationship between the EU and China that was highly dominated by Berlin, Paris, and London. And all of a sudden, this subgroup is created, and Brussels is concerned, and probably lends a little bit more of an ear to what the region has to say about the China-EU relationship. Otherwise, it's going to go directly through the 16+1. So it made it a group, it gave it a voice, a slightly bigger voice within the EU-China relationship, and to that, I take my example. I'm a French-born, UK-residing researcher on EU-China relations. I've mostly, over the past 5 years, been looking at the relation, and probably wrongly, through Berlin, through London, and through, which is the last one? Paris. And I've been invited this year 4 times to go to Central and Eastern European countries. And if that isn't bringing the region to the force, at least in terms of research and hopefully in terms of policy recommendation, it's done something for the region. So there is, behind this China-initiated initiative, something to be gained on the part of Central and Eastern European countries, and they actually do recognize it, and this is why it's going on. The second thing, and the second point to debunk here, is the importance of China in the region. All of a sudden, in 5 years, all of the think tank world, at least relating to China, all of the research community has been speaking about the 16+1 and the fact that China was getting into Central and Eastern Europe, and that it was one of the new big powers there. But in fact, China is actually a very small player in the region. It remains way behind the EU, of course, the US, but also South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. So we've got a situation here where China is pretty much still a minor actor economically in the region. In Czech Republic, just to give this example, 0.5% of the investment comes from China, and it's mostly in real estate. So there's little fuss to have about this, really. Actually, investment from Taiwan are 5 times bigger, just to give you a sense of comparison. Poland, as another example, does 60% of its trade with the EU, but it does much less than 5% with China. So you've got a big imbalance here, and probably a lot to be said about the fact that China isn't a big economic player in the region, which isn't to say that the potential is not big, which isn't to say that trading with the second economic power isn't of potential and isn't of interest to the countries. But when you compare what China proposed at the first 16+1 summit, which was a credit line for the region, so for 16 countries, which was 10 billion euros, for projects, different projects in infrastructure, in industry, and you compare that to EU funds, which from 2007 to 2015 were 175 billion, which means that every single country on average got more than what China was proposing for the 16 of these countries. Well, there's little to be comparing and little to be worried in economic terms, at least. So the leverage that China has is more of a symbolic, political one at the moment than it is an economic one, or at least if it is economic, it relies on a potential and the idea of a potential.
So just to conclude here on this segment, would you then agree with the statement that comes often at these 16+1 forums that in some way 16+1 is an invention to allow countries from post-socialist Europe to sort of catch up on their relations with China compared to Western Europe? In a way, it contributes to paradoxically Westernization of their attitude towards China, which is now more pragmatic than before. As we know, before, this region has been very ideological on China.
I don't know so much about the ideological part, but I know that 16+1 is mostly 16 bilateral relationships with China, and it's the form it takes the most, than it is a general groupings relation with China, but it is one channel that is open that wasn't before, and therefore of much interest to the region.
Thank you very much. Roland, you recently wrote an op-ed, you shared it with us, thanks for that, which discussed sort of comparing US and China, but in this occasion I'd like to use more your opinion on the US. The challenge of dealing with US in the era of Trump, what it means for Central Europe, and what are the challenges?
Right, well, thanks, Anastas. When I first read the full title of the session, you know, I'm German, I'm based in Brussels. I was hesitant to read to the end because I thought external actors in Central Europe, they're going to talk about Germany. No, they're not. So it's actually only the US, China, and Russia. I was relieved. So coming back to your question, yeah, my op-ed was titled "Why China is Still a Threat and the US Still an Ally," and I would stick to that even after the scandalous leaving of the Paris Climate Accord. About China, just one word because it's been mentioned by Agatha. I think the economic dependency and especially financial dependency, limited as it may be, but the dependency which is being built up through the bilateral relationships in the 16+1 comes at a price, and we've seen this in the arbitral tribunal case between the Philippines and China about territorial questions in the South China Sea, where Hungary clearly watered down the EU position, which was initially to invoke and to appeal to international arbitration in a much stronger wording, and it was watered down at the request of China in Hungary. So there are concrete political effects which are based on the way Chinese define their own interests and their power games in the world. So that's one thing. Now, as far as the US are concerned, first of all, I would claim that the US has been, for a very, very long time, certainly in the last 25 years, basically a force for good in this region. That has not changed. There has been a special relationship between Central Europe and the United States, which has never been fully appreciated, maybe not even understood, and maybe sometimes wrongly attacked by the West Europeans, as kind of, you know, these are the traitors of specific European values as opposed to American values. You know, 2003, Rumsfeld, the old and the new Europe, That was when, this was a time when someone like Jacques Chirac, President of France, could say that the Central Europeans have missed an excellent opportunity to shut up. Which, you know, whether they were wrong or right at the time, but the tone in which this was said is not conducive to European solidarity and building a strong European Union. So let me say that first of all. I think the US is a force for good. The special relationship that exists between Central Europe and the United States has reasons, and it has actually served Europe well. So that's one thing. Second, when it comes to the Trump administration. Now, I think, again, in no part of Europe was there more fear, actual fear, to be felt after the US election. I was in Riga 3 days on the 11th of November. It's called Bear Slayers Day, and it refers to something in World War I. Bear Slayers Day is a kind of day of national pride in connection with the military. And at the conference I was, in which I participated there, the fear about what is happening to Atlanticism, what is happening to the alliance, could be clearly felt. I think in comparison to that, now, 7 months down the line, I think we're in a much more certain place. Even given the lack of clarity about Article 5, you know, but after all, Trump did mention Article 5, the security guarantee, in the presence of a Central European head of state, Romanian President Iohannis. But if you just, I think the reason why we're in more certain territory now is in what the US is actually doing. The financial commitments, the military commitments within the enhanced forward presence, the actual deployment of troops, and of course the non-materialization of the bromance between Putin and Trump. It's just not happening, and I would claim it cannot happen, because this president, through the whole Russia collusion story, which is developing more and more branches and is keeping Washington so busy and US media so busy, through all this, he is boxed in. He cannot move forward on lifting the sanctions or whatever. Here, this is another fact. The Senate is just working on actually new sanctions against Russia in the banking sector, which will be very, very difficult to undo for the US president. So, you know, just one more example of what is really happening, aside from the indeed ominous rhetoric that you have heard in the past from Trump himself, before and after the election. So, you know, to sum it all up, I think while uncertainty still exists about the alliance, the balance on the whole is vastly positive of the US role in this region, and it actually goes a long way to counterbalance the indeed dangerous influences that we have by Russia in the region. We can come to that later on, but I would leave it at this as a short assessment of what is happening with the United States and Central Europe.
One quick point, how about values? These spillover effects.
Look, US democracy is old and strong. It is asserting itself as we speak vis-a-vis a president who has indeed, more than any predecessor in the last 70 or 100 or 110 years, however you want to count it, has thrown doubt upon the US commitment to the West and to the liberal global order and to liberal democracy. You know, so the president has cast doubt on it. I think US democracy has forcefully responded. The president is just coming under an indictment by US attorneys for business practices. You know, and this is just the beginning. So I think if you take the United States as a country, there is no fundamental difference in values between either Europe and North America, Europe and the United States, or even parts of the European Union and the US. So that's what I would answer.
Thank you for the very determined reply. Yeah, Peter, the debates in the region, the domestic politics level, the perceptions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anastas. Thank you all for presenting the three countries. So for me, it's an easy task to just wrap it up somehow from the regional perspective, because I'm the only speaker from the region. But before moving to that, I just have to comment on your comment that Trump-like figures start to emerge in the region. And of course, we are as Central Europeans, yes, we always want to be pioneers. So we had our Trump-like figures even before Trump. Anyway, coming back to the topic, I really like the topic, even though I agree that it's rather broad, because it brings together this micro perspective on the region with the global reshuffling of great powers. But what the narrative you usually read in the media, both in the region but also elsewhere, is the following. You have a weakened European Union, you have a Eurosceptic Visegrad, and here I talk about Central Europe as Visegrad, which is not really precise, but let's stick to that. Then you have a United States which are increasingly isolationist, and this vacuum in Central Europe is filled by these rising or supposedly rising great powers such as Russia and China. That would be the simple narrative. And of course, as you know from speeches like this one, after you create a straw man, you try to shoot it down again. So that's what I will be trying to do here. And I'll start from a sort of historical perspective, looking at what in general, and it has very practical political consequences, what is the regional attitude to great powers in general. And as you can probably guess, because we Czechs even have our own word for expression for that, the Munich complex, we are, and not only Czechs, I think it applies to all the countries to some extent, we are extremely distrustful towards great powers and having a strong, firm relationship with a great power. I'm not talking about economic ties, that's fine, but having an ally or a strong alliance with a great power is always tricky. And I think if you look at the political spectrum in any of the four countries, I think you can divide it very easily, and I'm not oversimplifying much, into parties which hate Russia and parties which hate Germany, basically, or are afraid of Russia and are afraid of Germany. Of course, you have the special case of Poland, where you have parties that are afraid of both at the same time, which is not the case in the Czech Republic, but still, that would be roughly the division. And again, it has very practical consequences. Just 2 weeks ago, an opinion poll conducted in the four countries was released, asking the citizens of Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic about their attitudes to NATO and to Russia. And you would be surprised to hear that in all four countries, the majorities of citizens supported neutrality both towards Russia and to the United States. I mean, it was almost 3/4 of the respondents in Slovakia, 61% in the Czech Republic, 58% in Hungary, and perhaps most surprisingly, 53% in Poland. And I read some comments by Western commentators who talked about a strategic reorientation of Central Europe. Of course, it's not a strategic reorientation of Central Europe, but I think it's exactly a reflection of that moment, of this distrust. Right? You cannot trust because they are great powers. So, and my conclusion here is that if any external great power wants to build a lasting alliance, and again I'm talking about a trade deal, but a lasting alliance with any Central European country, it has to be based on the idea of exception. And you find it time and again in our political discourses. If any politician wants to justify a strong alliance with the United States or with Germany, it always has to be based on the idea that this great power is unlike any other great power, right? So United States, they are a benign hegemon. Or Germany, it's not the Germany of 70 years ago, it's a different Germany. And there, I think you already have a partial answer to what I think about the involvement of Russia or China in the region, because they are exactly this old type, or at least in the public perception here, they are exactly the old type of great power. They are not transformed, and in fact Russians, they are very proud about being traditional, perhaps in a different sense, but it resonates with this idea that it's the traditional great power and that cannot be trusted. So in other words, what I want to say is, if I should answer the question of whether China or Russia's strategies towards Central Europe can be successful, my answer is definitely no. And here only a couple of brief points on Russia's and Chinese influence here. I definitely consider it a myth that Russia's influence in the region is growing. In fact, the asymmetric warfare or propagandist warfare of Russia here, for me, is a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength, because they cannot compete with the West in terms of military power, in terms of security guarantees, in terms of attractiveness of the social model they offer. What they do is they try to influence the media in this asymmetric way. It can work to some extent. It can, as you know, up to 1/5 of the populations of these countries sometimes say they trust this type of outlet, so which is not a small number, but still, that's, I think, is the maximum this strategy can achieve. And I have to say, I'm similarly skeptical towards China and the Chinese involvement here. I agree with the potential, but if you look at the results, and now I'm talking especially about the Visegrad 4, it's meager. In the Czech Republic, the total amount invested by China even decreased last year. It's not going up. And if you look in what the Chinese invested here, it's non-productive sectors. So it's not industries, it's not the same type of investments we get not only from Europeans like from Germany, but also from East Asians. Koreans, or Japanese, they invested manifold times more, but also in car industry, for instance, or TV screens or things like that. Nothing like that from the Chinese. They buy a football club, for instance, right? Fine. Some real estate, nice. But that's it. The infrastructure projects in our region, there was one example in Poland, which is something the Chinese never talk about again, because it was a total failure. Of course, there are some countries, Serbia would be a counter-example probably, where it works differently, but that's a very different country with a very different infrastructural demands as well, compared to the Czech Republic, for instance. So again, I agree, there is some potential, it can work to some extent economically speaking, but this noble idea of a strategic shift or a replacement of the Western alliance by the East, which is sometimes discussed in these countries these days, that's utter nonsense for me. So, and I'll end up on this positive note. Thank you.
On that note, I don't think that at least China would promote an alternative to the West. What you see rather with the Belt and Road Initiative and these new Chinese foreign policies, more like trying to renegotiate global economic governance and global economic flows, which is ultimately determined by Chinese domestic concerns. Right. Some people talk about exporting overcapacity, but on the long run, I think is actual interest in boosting real economy not just across the Eurasian continent, but also in these other regions, which is not, at the end of the day, altruism, it's just creating more demand for trade with not cheap goods, with advanced goods such as satellites or trains or nuclear technology. Anyway, a quick follow-up question, and then you had a response, right? You mentioned the public opinion polls. To what extent do they matter for foreign policy? This is one question in political science literature, but because it not always is necessarily connected, how foreign policy is shaped and what people think.
Well, what happened in the, I would say, even last 5 years in the region is, and it's quite novel here, I think, is the politicization of foreign policy. I mean, foreign policy before, even the EU membership was had always been seen as a kind of technical issue, right? There was this, what political science literature called permissive consensus. So basically the idea that, yes, we belong, so negotiate as quickly as possible, and we become EU members. But in the last 5 years, all across these 4 countries, you have suddenly, I mean, there were several, in the last 2-3 years, you have several large-scale protests about the visit of the Chinese president in the Czech Republic. I mean, that is something you would never believe, and had never happened before with any high-ranking foreign official in the last 20 years, or at least as far as I recall. So I don't have any numbers there, opinion polls, but what I see is that these ideas, the relation to Russia or to China, become a contested domestic political issue. I mean, in the last election campaign, you even had a political party in the Czech Republic that had these huge posters, the ODS for Czechs, which had the motto, "We belong to the West, not the East," right? So it's strange in a sense, of course we are not Chinese, but in a sense it exactly plays this or resonates in the public because there is this contestation of where the region really belongs.
All right. Before we go to those questions, you had a...
Yeah, just two brief remarks. One on the rhetoric of Xi Jinping in Davos. I think it should be mentioned. I mean, he really presented himself as the advocate of socially and environmentally conscious openness, and global governance, at the very time when Donald Trump was screaming about America first. And this actually brought even some intelligent Europeans to say that, well, we've got to rethink our alliances and so on. Well, I say nonsense. One look at China's national governance, internally as well as in bilateral relations with certain corrupt dictatorships in Africa and elsewhere. And of course, last but by no means least, their constant support for North Korea, which is the one country that still can get Asia and possibly the world into a terrible war. That is the real face of global governance of China. And so, I mean, these nice words in Davos don't convince me.
Do they really support North Korea? Because
oh, they're frustrated. So they have, without Chinese support, Kim Jong-un would not be where he is, and there would be no nuclear missiles in North Korea. If it hadn't been for consistent Chinese backing since the Korean War for the North Korean regime, that country, maybe with some limited violence or whatever, but that country would not be the hellhole, and I'm saying this in full conscience, the hellhole that it is today, starving its own people. And, you know, I mean, China itself, of course, is no angel when it comes to human rights, but North Korea is certainly a terrible place to live in. And without Chinese support, this would not be the case. So let's face that. When they talk about openness, you know, why not opening some prison cells?
I mean, you can also say if it was not for Chinese pressure, the North Korean crisis might have escalated as well, but I mean, it's a...
okay, that's a long debate
anyway,
about North Korea. No, but I wanted to say something about this question about Russia here, which Petr also raised. I mean, and of course, Maria mentioned it in the very beginning. Extremely legitimate question: how strong or how weak is Russia really? Well, I think there are two dangers here. One is to overestimate, one is to underestimate their strengths. You know, underestimating Russian strength leads to complacency. That's probably even the more dangerous option here. And overestimating actually leads to fears that may paralyze us and actually then turn into real Russian strength. You know, I mean, my solution to this dilemma would be to simply state that Russia, Putin, is playing a weak hand masterfully. You know, he's got bad cards in his hand, but he's playing them so beautifully that he at least comes to a draw, if not to a win, in the respective rounds of the card game that we're playing here. So you know, and that should be the point of departure, not the question that, oh, you know, I mean, we're much stronger than Russia militarily, economically, in whatever sense, and so we don't have to worry. I mean, that's the wrong. It's the wrong road to take.
Maria, anything to add on this?
Yes, no, I agree. It's dangerous both to overestimate and underestimate. The thing is that it's not anymore a chess game, it's a card game. And what is the real strength of Mr. Putin is, of course, that he plays by no rules. He doesn't use the rules, whereas, you know, other players do. So that's his strength, and you never know. He's quite unpredictable still, so you never know what he's going to do. Although on that issue, I can also argue that because we know that he's unpredictable, it is not dangerous anymore. You know, you know not to trust him. You know, to check the sources, etc.
You wanted to follow on the same?
No, Agatha, go.
I just want to respond to the Davos comment. To me, the issue with Xi Jinping's addressing Davos wasn't so much speaking to non-democratic countries, because coming from France, I can't really say anything. I think a lot of countries do this, and it's unfortunately part of real politics. I think with North Korea, China just doesn't want US troops and US bases to be actually bordering its own territory. But the real problem with the Davos speech, and the real problem I think that's the Central Europe is facing, is the fact that China is preaching openness, globalization, without actually walking the talk. And that is because it isn't nearly as open to European investments as we are to Chinese investments. It is because when China comes and is welcome to bid for procurement in the EU, European companies aren't welcome to bid in China for procurement. And when it actually does, and when it comes to the 16+1 and sits down with Central European leaders, it promotes a model that isn't EU compliant and still wants it to be the one solution for the 16+1 in the region. By that I mean that China usually comes, in terms of infrastructure in particular, with financing, extremely beautiful, lovely, great interest rate financing, yet with the condition, tight condition, that its companies actually perform the construction of these infrastructures. This is something that the EU has said very clearly that we have rules against, and still China plays deaf while understanding, I think, very clearly that this is EU rules and can't be overrun. And this is probably where I am a little bit afraid that China is continuing, despite being explained every single year at every EU summit, at every EU connectivity platform summit, that those rules are there, still on a bilateral level promoting this kind of interaction. However, one thing that I should note, and I think is very good for the EU and actually very positive, is that contrary to the remark about Hungary lining with China on the South China Sea and on many other issues, I would see Hungary as more of an exception than an example, more of an exception in general, because when China comes with an amazingly interesting financing, when it comes and says, I'm going to build roads for you, I'm going to build bridges for you, actually none of the member states in Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, have said yes to it. They've all said, absolutely not, you need to bid like everyone else, and you need to go in line, and you need to either finance or procure, but you can't be doing both. And actually, China has done it. There's a lot of places where China has shown a willingness when it really has economic interest to bid. But on a bilateral level, it keeps coming back saying, this is the model we'd like to promote, and this is what we would like to see in the future, which isn't acceptable. So this is my main concern when it comes to China.
But this strategy to follow up, for instance, succeeds in the Balkans.
Of course, because they're not
which is a
EU
new
member
type
state.
of a new type of issue for the EU, facing external actors in the enlargement areas, because the Balkan countries are not yet fully compliant with the acquis.
Exactly, because they're not tied by as tight rules. But my second and kind of linked worries is that in the long term, it could build resentment if you define a region that is 16 countries, 5 of them which have access to Chinese financing without any EU rules and can tap into the 10 billion credit line I was speaking about before. Can it bring and breed resentment in the long term from EU member states about EU rules? And it's an open question, but I think it's one that is worth asking.
Anyway, did you have a...
Can I just comment as well? Yeah. I have just 3 brief comments. One I totally agree, because there I think is the one element where Central European policies on China are slowly being European or westernized in a sense, is this keyword of reciprocity that was not here 5 years ago, but now because the countries grow richer as well, want to invest, their companies want to build bridges in China, you know, the other way around, and it doesn't work. So suddenly they listen more to the experience of France and Germany and Western European countries somewhat more. So I think it's changing a bit. And 2 more comments related to both our discussion and the comments you see.
I was going to bring that
okay,
part.
Good. Sorry. Can I go on?
Go on.
Now, the first point, I think that's, for me, this is the, and perhaps I'll be a bit provocative there, but the idea, a perennial question of foreign policy analysis as a subdiscipline of IR, international relations studies, is in how far a country that is domestically democratic always contributes to building a good system of global governance, right? So a connection between democracy and good governance externally, or even more provocative, the alternative, right? A country that is non-democratic, can it ever contribute to good governance internationally? And that's the question on partnership with China on ecology. And, you know, can we say that even though the United States remain or will remain a robust democracy under Trump as well, but still it might be quite harmful to the global governance in many ways. You know, so this decoupling in political science, this is basically a dogma, right? So it's always seen as connected. But can we see it as a kind of disconnection? And if yes, then of course it opens up a number of questions on what issues can we really cooperate with China, for instance, or is it something through which we dirty our hands, right? And the final point I wanted to make is on the cooperation with Russia and the Visegrad 4. I think today you would hardly find a policy area where the Visegrad 4 is more divided than the attitude to Russia. I mean, even on the sanctions, you have those like Poland who are, of course, strongly against lifting the sanctions. You have Hungarians who would do it tomorrow, if not yesterday. And then you have, you know, muddling somewhere in between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And it's not only about sanctions, it's also about how they perceive the conflict in Ukraine and many other issues. Even it spilled over into the regional discussions about the Eastern Partnership, which was the flagship 5 or 10 years ago of the Visegrad 4. After the EU entry, the Eastern Partnership was the big topic for the Visegrad 4. And suddenly it's become less visible because it becomes quite sensitive to discuss these issues with Orban, for instance.
Do we collect also questions from the audience?
Can I just answer a tiny thing on the question that is on the prompter?
Sure.
Just a remark on working with China on ecology. I don't know who asked it, but it's a good question.
I think perhaps they mean also climate change.
And climate change, exactly. And just as a quick explainer of the China-EU relationship, you've got 3 legs to it. You've got economics, politics, and security. On security, we do a little bit of non-traditional security, but the overwhelming potential or part of it we can't address because there's an embargo on China, so this is out of the table. Politics, we usually are very annoying speaking about human rights, which China doesn't really like. Speaking about the rule of law, bringing it over and over again to the table. So there's potential for cooperation, but it's always a little bit reluctant. And economically, the last few years I've seen a lot of WTO cases being brought against China, and has actually made the relationship very tense. So much so that at the last EU summit on the 1st and 2nd of June, there was going to be a joint communique on climate, and it didn't happen. And that's because there was so much tension on trade that they couldn't agree to actually have a joint communication. In any case, this is apparently the only issue where both of them can agree. So yes, there's a lot to be done there because it is the one very non-controversial issue that binds now China and the EU, especially with the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement. So I see a bright future there.
Yeah, global governance and China. Look, if China was really about global governance, it wouldn't practice the territorial expansion and rejection of arbitration mechanisms that it is practicing in the South China Sea. If China was really about global governance, it would open up its markets. If China was really about global governance, it would not have a planned and coordinated violation of copyright law on a global scale. If China was really about global governance, it would not support criminal hacking, again, on the level of state actors and institutions of the security apparatus. And finally, about the Paris Climate Accord. Look, with or without the US, of course we're going to cooperate with China like we're going to cooperate with everyone else who wants to cooperate. I mean, under George W. Bush, the US was not part of the climate deal, and we still went forward. And, you know, I mean, the biggest polluter in this world is not the United States, but China. Even 10 years from now, China is going to pollute more than the United States. So, I mean, let's really keep things in perspective here. And yes, cooperate with China on the climate deal, but not pretend that this is going to be the new global axis and a new kind of strategic alliance.
Maria, do you have any comments on the question on cooperation with Russia, and can see countries play active role?
Well, I think as I mentioned, I do believe that CE countries have a unique position because as the post-World War II world developed, we've seen Russia and CE countries developing together, no less. And I think they are the ones who understand Russia much better than Western Europe and the United States understand Russia. And therefore, they are better positioned to analyze what is going on, and although they are, of course, more susceptible to fall, as you said with the poll results, they quite surprised me that 20% of people believe what Russia today tells them. That's quite a big number. So that's a danger as well that should be considered. But the fact of the matter is that with this understanding of Russia, CE countries, of course, are better positioned to recommend to develop policies to help analyze what Russia is up to and what is real, what is not real, what is fake reality that Russia is so good at creating, and what can be like real outcomes of the certain activities.
Before any further questions, I'd really like to open the floor and give a chance if anyone has a comment or.
Thank you. My question goes to Ms. Maria.
Can you just introduce yourself, please?
Olga Spirandi. My question goes to Ms. Maria Ordzhonikidze. While talking about Russia posing a threat to Europe and beyond, among others through military means, you mentioned Ukraine and Syria twice, though you failed to mention Georgia. My question is very simple and plain. Why haven't you done so? Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry I haven't, because it's 2008, that's it's all. In fact, I have to mention Transnistria as well, if we talk about Georgia. Of course, I mean, Russia is known to sort of create this sanitary belt around its borders. That's essentially what it does. So Transnistria is between Russia and Moldova, and Georgia, of course, when we have now two territories that are full kind of in between legal framework. Ukraine, of course, Crimea, Syria, and if you look to the west, Tajikistan, I mean, you can just start this conversation, never ended. That's why I didn't mention it.
There was a question.
Do we have...
Thank you very much. My name is Petr Havlik. I'm from Vienna. My impression was that the discussion is a little bit static. And what I would miss is to looking a little bit into the future. Regarding China, China is rising power, and it's emerging just on the global world stage in the economy, and in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. And if we are looking what has happened during the last 5 years, and we try to extrapolate 5 years into the future, I think that the situation would be quite different. And regarding Russia, my question would be to the panel, what are the proposals for moving forward? Because it seems that now there is a tendency to escalation of this conflict, which is dangerous. And I would very much like to hear some positive suggestions. And regarding the USA, last but not least, it is clear that United States is, at least with the new President Trump, is withdrawing from Europe. So where is the replacement of this US role? Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? I suggest we collect a few more, and then we close. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Natalia Żaba. I'm a journalist based in Belgrade. This conversation was very interesting because you are somehow, in some terms, polarized. But what I would like to hear from you would be, what is the perspective for small countries like CEE countries, like Balkan countries, to become a real partner in this global fight, which we are now observing, not just to be like, you know, peons on the chess table being moved back and forward.
Thank you. My name is Martin Ogrozde, and my question is that everybody was talking about the US withdrawing from the Paris Accords. And my provocative question is that, is it important? And I'm asking this because the Paris Accords were voluntary, so anybody who doesn't want to apply them didn't have to do so. There are no sanctions attached. And as we see, many US cities, states, and other organizations are actually joining, of course, informally, the Paris Accords. And what happened is that Donald Trump has reinforced our prejudices about him, that he's I'm sorry for putting it this way, an American moron. So in this regard, not much has changed, at least to what I see, but I put this in a way which is provocative for a reason.
More questions? Okay, one more, and then we have...
Olda Bureš, Metropolitan University, Prague. I was a bit puzzled that in the title of the panel, Germany was missing. And I would say that that's the real elephant in the Central European room. And I would just like to challenge you to convince me otherwise. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for the questions. And before we give the floor to the speakers, I'd like to take my hat of a moderator off and put my hat of a China guy on. I have just two provocative comments. I mean, you said Chinese strategy cannot be successful, but you know, I think it's the first time since 1949 that China has managed to bring on the same table the 16 countries. This has not even happened during Cold War times when they were part of this socialist Commonwealth. And it's the first time there is a consensus that at least we have to talk to China. And this consensus is also inside countries, because what the Chinese do, they also speak with opposition parties. So it's not like Russia, where there is division, which of course we should pursue. It's not, I mean, yeah, there may be protests in the Czech Republic, but from what I know, Miloš Zeman is one of the most loyal partners of China in the region. And on China and global governance, I mean, I can see the points, but I somehow feel like they're more rooted in the 20th century, no offense. You know what would happen once China overtakes the US? The seat of the International Monetary Fund is moving to Beijing. What I'm saying, 40% of the global growth last year came from China. And if we talk about, and China for the first time is, being really proactive in terms of setting some kind of agenda, some kind of institutions, trying to provide some inclusion to primarily developing countries. And this is not singing apologies to China, but at least I think one should give credit, especially once there has been so many shortcomings. At least, not even to take it at face value, but see it as a kind of, previous, not the previous, but the Bush administration called on to China to be a responsible stakeholder. And, now they're trying to provide these public goods, because, I mean, if you see this Belt and Road plan, so far is $1 trillion, which is 7 times what the Marshall Plan used to be, which is going to much of, infrastructure, to much of development, cooperation, and so on. Anyway, what I don't know how many minutes we have left, 10, 15 minutes, I think, huh?
12.
So if you can try to address, each of you in 2 minutes, the most pressing issues that you heard so far.
Should I start?
Yeah, we go with the...
Okay, good. So I have like 20 seconds for each of the questions. Anyway, Russia, the question about Russia, what can we do? I think until the 2018 presidential election, we cannot do really anything. Because this will be, as you all know, the West is in ideological terms. If you watch Russia Today or Sputnik News for 10 minutes, you see it very clearly that this is, there is so much hype about this, and it cannot simply be overcome because it's driven forward artificially. So I don't see any way of overcoming the impasse until that moment. After the election, it may be different. I think Russia might be also more conducive to more constructive engagement, but until then, I don't really see any way forward, especially because there is this strong ideological twist. If it were only a pragmatic question, like in the Chinese case, okay, how much reciprocity do we need in economic terms? Fair enough, but this is not the case with Russia. And and then about just cherry picking, China successful or not. My starting point was the idea of this renversement of the alliances. Can any of these powers replace the Western allies? And they cannot. I mean, if the success from the Chinese perspective is defined that they would gain some leverage, I mean, through Hungarians in their territorial disputes in East or South China Sea, that's perhaps might be defined as success. But in terms of really being an ally of these countries, I don't see in the foreseeable future any change there. Thank you.
I'll address 2 of your questions. The first one was yours about the long term, and you say 5 to 10 years. I tell you 3 years. New EU budget, no UK, new priorities. What happens? I was speaking about EU funds for infrastructure in Central Europe. What if those are not allocated anymore? What if they're slashed into? What if the priority is now on migration control, what if it is on terrorism in any case. There's a lot that can happen in 3 years, and with the new budget, that will probably reshuffle the cards. And it's a good point that you make that it's a long-term game, and China plays long-term most of the time. And I'll go with that again about China buying the Piraeus port, because for the moment the Piraeus port is mostly used as a port where you unload and then send it on smaller ships to other ports in Europe. It isn't yet linked through Central and Eastern Europe to Western Europe, but what if? What if it at some point China says, well, I'm going to play by the rules of the games, I'm going to build railroads that go through Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm going to do it according to EU laws, and I'm going to make the region a logistical hub. I'm going to put industrial zones all along the line, because it's really well connected now, and actually labor costs are much lower. Well, this could change the picture, the whole picture actually, in the long term. For the moment, I spoke to logistics experts, and they think it's going to take at least 15 to 20 years for anyone using the northwestern European ports, northwestern ports of Europe to move to Piraeus. But it is something that might happen in 15, 20 years. So that could change something. About Serbia, I was in Serbia 2 weeks ago, and I heard something that was, I thought, very interesting. I was speaking to a former diplomat to China, and the one thing he said that I thought was great is he looked at me and he said, you know what, Agatha, I really like China. I really like China. And you know, what if in this whole talk we're missing one thing, which is that maybe China has a compelling story about One Belt, One Road, about you know, linking through development, about economic rights, which you agree on them or not, but it has a model of development that is different from the EU's. And what if small countries like Serbia, who aren't yet part of the EU, are actually compelled by this vision? And I think it is happening in Serbia at least. It might happen elsewhere. So it was a very good point for you.
Yeah, starting briefly with China and my 20th century view of that country. You know, just in order to take this time factor around one more turn, I think the mood that you get in several European capitals, especially in Brussels these days, is pretty upbeat. And much of the China hype of the last 15 years was based on the fact that, hey, we're not really getting forward in Europe anymore. You know, it was like almost the other side of the coin of our European frustration, depression, doom and gloom. So, you know, is China going to be the eternal future? I don't think so. And this has a lot to do with the way we look at ourselves and the European Union and its future development. And you know, whether China is responsible or not, glass is half full or half empty, or it has to be redesigned, whatever. I mean, I would just relativize some of the China hype which is dished out these days. And it's not that brand new anymore. Germany. All right. You know, would you believe me if I said that, honestly, Germany has been trying, with many failures and trial and error, but has been seriously trying to play the role of a benign hegemon? If you don't believe me because I'm German, we can shift the conversation to something else. We have to change the topic. But if you give me some credit for knowing what's being discussed and how in places like Berlin, seriously, I mean, Angela Merkel is the last person who would believe this rhetoric about being the leader of the free world. You know, she's been nominated that by Timothy Garton-Ash, who will receive the Prague Summit Award. But she herself would, I mean, like many other people in Berlin, would rather play a completely backstage role in this big power game in Europe. And is Germany becoming an external player in Central Europe? If yes, then it certainly is trying to do it in a positive way. And now let's come briefly to the mistakes. Yes, mistakes were made, especially in 2015. The fact that Central Europeans were not consulted about certain momentous decisions taken in Berlin in a matter of hours that had momentous effects until today and in the future. was a huge mistake, I think. I believe that a special relationship with countries like Poland, which took a long time to build, and I've been part of that, 7 years director of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Warsaw. So I know how painful it was and how difficult. And that was wasted away in a matter of hours. The process in 2015 took a little bit longer, and the estrangement that followed is still not completely over. But indeed, so mistakes were made. But again, Germany wouldn't be Germany if we didn't try to make up for it in some way, and try to slowly and patiently rebuild, and see if we can't come together on the question of refugees and migrants. Then let's look for other points where we can come together and we can actually make common proposals to the future construction of the European Union. I mean, that's the way not only the Chancellor and the Chancellor's office works these days, but that's the way the majority of the political class in Berlin thinks. And yes, there has been something like, as Viktor Orban called it, moral imperialism. You know, I mean, our imperialism used to come in boots. Now it comes in Birkenstock sandals. There is something not very sympa and even morally arrogant about the way much of German media and the German public opinion, and certainly the chattering classes, judged Central Europe in this whole migration crisis. But as I said, if there is any country that is willing to draw the lessons and to improve the next time around, I think it's Germany. Last point on escalation with Russia and the way forward. For a couple of reasons, I do believe that there is no constructive way forward with Russia. All we can do is prevent a major war. But that will not work. That will not work by answering every Russian aggression with an offer for talks and an opportunity for dialogue, because it will just increase the Kremlin's appetite for the next round of aggression. Russia today is more centralized and focused on one person than ever since the Soviet days of Stalin. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin has a manifest interest in weakening and actually destroying not only NATO but also the European Union. We need to face that truth. That's a fact. Okay? And from that point onward, we will discuss the relations between Russia and the West. We have forgotten about the principle of deterrence, would be my claim. Over the last 25 years, we're slowly rediscovering it. But frankly speaking, what we call enhanced forward presence, 4 battalions along the eastern flank of NATO, is no deterrence. That is no deterrence for the amounts of troops and material that Russia has amassed in its own country. So, deterrence means 3 things. You need to be able to defend yourself. You need to have the willingness to defend yourself and to hit back. And you need to communicate that to the other side effectively. We're still lacking on all 3 points. And deterrence means that in certain targeted moments and sectors, you are willing to escalate. Otherwise, it's not deterrence. So let's keep this in mind. Not go overboard, not overestimate Russian strength, but see very clearly where we have been much too weak and where we have, indeed, it is the West's mistake how Russia has behaved in the last 4 years. Or make that 8 years, or make that 15 years. It's our mistake because it was our forgetting of the basic rules of deterrence. It was our weakness, our lack of resolve to answer Russian aggression. That is how we have encouraged the Kremlin.
Maria.
Yes, well, I would probably try to play down the dramatic words that were just said. I believe strongly that it is not nuclear weapon and even not oil and gas weapon that Russia holds the strongest. It's the propaganda weapon at the moment, and it is very strong indeed. And really, for Europe to defend itself against that weapon, the most important thing is to stay strong. And Europe is indeed capable of being strong, as the sanctions unilaterally accepted by 27 member states at that moment showed. And that was the first time, I think, in all the history of European Union that Europe actually took a stance, a united stance against unacceptable behavior in 2014, and still hold strong on that, despite some of the countries, obviously, who are willing to get rid of those sanctions. But they are still in place, and they are going to remain in place, and they are being discussed in the US Congress, as far as I know, to be even voted into the law, which will make it even stronger. So I think, yes, the first thing to do is to create defense mechanisms, which are like those sanctions. Second thing is to really pay strong attention to what is fake reality, what is not fake reality. So analyze and think a lot, so use intellectual powers that Europe has and Russia lacks, because Russia is really losing its brains and its resources due to the situation that is inside the country as well. And creating digital security. There was a question on digital cyber attacks, and it's important to make sure that the mechanisms are put in place that will defend individual countries and unity of the European Union against such attacks in the future. And stay strong and defend the values, defend the European values. I think that's the most important part, because that's what Russia tries to destroy, essentially.
On that note, we head to coffee break. A round for applause for the speakers.